Hello from a really damp and grey and miserable North Yorkshire. It's really wet and horrible here today, so I thought I would liven things up a little bit by talking about a really interesting and useful aspect of music theory, the tritone, the so-called devil's interval. Now, lots of you ask me about the tritone all the time, and I think that's because of all the legends and mystique that have grown up around it. People think that the tritone is weird and exotic and strange. And that's kind of half right, because the tritone is weird and exotic and strange, and in some ways it deserves its reputation. But in other ways, it's really common and everyday. Lots of the chord progressions that we take for granted, for example, are driven by tritones. Tritones crop up in music all the time. So what we're going to do in today's tutorial is dig into exactly what a tritone is, how tritones work, and why they are so powerful. And along the way, we're also going to touch on some other really interesting aspects of music theory. Just before we go any further, a quick mention for a couple of my books that I think you'll really like. In particular, How to Really Play the Piano, the Stuff Your Teacher Never Taught You. How to Really Play the Piano has been on the market for more than 10 years now. Thousands of people have bought it. I've had fantastic feedback about it, so I'm sure that you'll like it as well. Basically, what it does is cover the stuff your teacher never taught you. So things like chords and harmony and getting started with improvisation and jazz and blues and pop and that kind of thing. You need to be able to read a little bit of sheet music in right and left hands, but that's about it. Yeah, so if you've got that basic skill on the piano, How to Really Play the Piano will take you to the next level. I should also mention 7 Studies in Pop Piano, which I don't give enough love to really, because people who have got it really like it. Basically, if you're interested in playing like Elton John or Ben Folds or Tori Amos, piano players like that who play in that kind of pop piano or ballad piano style, then 7 Studies will really help you. It's 7 short pieces of music in pop piano style with full kind of explanation, walkthrough, suggestions for improvisation, explanations of the chords, things like that. Both of these books are available both as print editions and ebooks, and you can find out more about them by clicking the links in the description text right underneath this video or in the little YouTube cards that pop up in the top right hand corner of the screen. I should also give a quick mention to my Patreon crowdfunder, patreon.com/BillHilton. Doesn't cost much to sign up, but there are some great benefits to be had on my Patreon, including my downloadable piano packs with video walkthroughs, which I think you'll really like. So once the video is over, do go and check out patreon.com/BillHilton. A tritone is really just a type of interval. Now, as you may know, interval is the term we use to describe the distance between any 2 notes on the piano keyboard. So, for example, if we had middle C and the E above middle C, we would say that those 2 notes were an interval of a major third apart. If we had C and the G above middle C, we would say that those 2 notes were a perfect fifth apart. Perfect fifth is the interval. And you can perhaps see how we're building those intervals. What I'm doing there to create those intervals is just counting up the major scale. You can go down as well, but we'll stick to up for now. So 1, 2, 3, an interval of a major third. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, an interval of a perfect fifth. Now, there are some really important intervals that we need to know about. Probably the most important interval of all is the octave. Okay, the same note but just the next octave up on the piano keyboard. So that is the interval of an octave. By the way, when we play 2 notes of an interval together, that's not a chord. It doesn't have enough notes to be a chord. Instead, it has a special name. We call it a dyad. So that's a dyad, that's a dyad, that's a dyad. It's just 2 notes of an interval played at the same time. So an octave is a really important interval. The other 2 really important intervals are the semitone and the tone, which are the smallest intervals. If you're in the States, you'll call them half steps and whole steps, but I'll stick to semitone and tone or whole tone for today. A semitone is the interval between any note and the next note above it or below it on the keyboard. So from C to C sharp is an interval of a semitone. Likewise, C to B natural, we would say that that distance is a semitone because those are the next door neighbour notes. A whole tone is just two semitones. So we would say that D is a whole tone, a tone above C. There's one semitone, there's another semitone, and there's a whole tone. A tritone is three whole tones. So if we start at C and count up three whole tones, C to D is one, D to E is another, because there are our two semitones, so that's two whole tones, that's a major third. But then if we add a third whole tone, two more semitones, we get our tritone. Now, tritones are really interesting for lots of reasons. For example, the tritone is the halfway point of the octave. There's our octave between C and C. We could choose any octave, but I'll stick with this one because it's simple. And there is the F sharp, the tritone above the root. And that is the exact halfway point of the octave. You might be tempted to think it was the fourth or the fifth, but it isn't. The tritone is halfway. The tritone is also interesting because it is, like the octave, its own inversion. Now, most intervals, if you turn them upside down, change. So, for example, if we have a major third and we turn it upside down, if we take the E and put it down here, it's not a major third anymore, it's a minor sixth. You can see that the distance between those two notes is bigger. Similarly, if we have a perfect fifth, okay, if we take the G and put it down here, so the interval is turned upside down, you can see that the interval has become smaller. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a perfect fourth instead. But whichever way you chop a tritone, it's still a tritone. Okay, so there is C to F sharp, our tritone. If we take the F sharp down here and count up the number of tones, there's one whole tone, another whole tone, and the third. So that is a tritone just as much as that is. And the only other interval that does that is the octave. Okay, that's an octave, that's an octave, that's a tritone, that's a tritone. But the tritone's most important characteristic, from our point of view as musicians, is its instability. The tritone really wants to go places. Now, it's that instability that gives the tritone its power. And that's because tonal music, by which I mean the majority of songs, the majority of classical music and jazz, tonal music is driven by patterns of harmonic tension and release, of harmonic instabilities resolving to stability. The classic expression of that is the 5-1 chord progression. Just to go through that, if you don't know what it is, let's say we're in a key like C major. Then our number 5 chord is the chord built on the 5th degree of the scale. So the 5th degree of the C major scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is G. We would say that G is an interval of a fifth above the tonic, C. So the chord built on that note is G. We would call that the 5 chord or the dominant chord in the key of C major. And the 1 chord is the tonic chord, okay, C. And you can probably hear that the 5 chord has a really strong pull. It really wants to take us back to the 1 chord. 5, 1. And it doesn't matter what shape we play those chords in, so we could play the G like that. 5, 1. Dominant, tonic. Incredibly common, crops up in nearly all music, okay? We can make that instability to stability, that tension release feeling, even stronger if we take that basic dominant chord and make it a dominant 7th. That is a G7 chord, really incredibly common in music. If you've played any kind of chordal music, you'll have come across simple 7 chords like G7 or C7 or F7 or whatever. We'll stick with G7 here because we're in the key of C major. Now let's take that G7 chord and play it in this inversion and listen to how it resolves to the 1 chord. 5, 1. Can you hear that's a really strong instability to stability? Okay, we feel like it's really pushing us home. Now, a tritone lies at the heart of that G7 chord and is what gives it its power. There's the tritone in question, F to B. There are our 3 tones. Okay, why does that work so well? Well, that's because though that tritone represents the 2 tendency tones, as we call them, in the key of C major. Here's our scale of C major, and there's our F and our B, the 4th and 7th degrees of the scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They are the tendency tones. The B is the strongest one. We call that the leading tone. It really wants to pull us up to the C, the note a semitone above it. But F, the 4th degree, is also a tendency tone. It really wants to sink down, not quite as strongly as the B. It really wants to sink down onto the E. Okay, so we have tension of the tritone. Both the tendency tones want to push apart and become the part of the tonic chord. So the fact that the 7th chord has a tritone in it is really important. And remember that tritones stay the same whichever way up you put them. Yeah, that's important as well. So if we play our G7 there, we still have a tritone, but here it's between the B and the F. Okay, so instead of the F and the B being in that position, they're there, but because we've swapped them around, we know that the tritones are the same whichever way we invert them. The tritone is always present in the 7 chord. Powering dominant 7th chords is just one of the interesting and useful things that tritones can do. Their instability makes them so flexible they can be exploited to achieve lots of different effects. Say for example you want to change key. Tritones are very handy for that. Typically what happens is you go from your original key to your new key via a kind of period of instability and uncertainty that might be short or it might be long. However long it is, there's a pretty good chance that there's a tritone in there somewhere, almost certainly buried in a dominant 7th or maybe a diminished 7th chord. So tritones don't simply have to be used to resolve outwards to the tonic of the key you're in. You can use them to build chords in their own right. So the diminished 7th, which I just mentioned, is in some ways built of tritones. There's a C diminished 7 chord, and you can see there are 2 tritones there, 1 and 2, and they're kind of interlocking. And the diminished 7 can be used in its own right, okay, for its kind of weird sound. It's often known as the horror movie chord, but it's also a really useful functional chord, for example in jazz progressions, but also again in modulations. Another place where the tritone sticks its oar in is in the blues scale. Okay, one of the most important blues notes in the basic blues scale, which is what I played there, is the diminished 5th. There's another tritone. Okay, so this is an interval which has lots and lots of uses, and it all comes down to that fundamental instability. My personal favourite use of the tritone is in the tritone substitution, which is a technique we often use in jazz, and it's worth looking at in detail because it shows how weird and counterintuitive tritones can be. Let's imagine we're playing a jazz song in the key of C major, just to keep things nice and simple. Now the chances are that somewhere in the chord progression for this song we are going to come across a 5-1 resolution, which might be written as G7 to C or G7 to C major 7, just as a nod to the underlying jazziness. Now what we would tend to do in those circumstances is change those chords in some way, and in particular change the 5 chord, or the dominant chord or the dominant 7th chord, to stop it sounding so clean cut and neat and tidy. Yeah, that doesn't sound like jazz. We want a cooler sound. So the tritone substitution delivers that for us, and the way it works is we find the root note of the dominant chord, which is G, and from there we go up a tritone. Okay, and that gives us the note D flat, and we build a whole new dominant 7 chord off that D flat. So we have D flat 7, and as you can hear, it still resolves really nicely to C or to C major 7, but it sounds an awful lot jazzier than G7 to C. Okay, now here's the really interesting thing. We've completely changed that dominant chord. It is completely different. We've moved it a tritone up from the original dominant chord. But look how it works. The tritone within that chord that is making things happen is unchanged. It's still the F and the B. So there's that tritone in the G7 chord. Okay, we could play it in that inversion, it's still a tritone. But if we play the D flat 7 chord, that tritone is still there, it's still providing the power underneath the chord, although the chord has changed completely. I find that completely mind-blowing. It still amazes me kind of 20 years after I learned how to do it. But it shows you how tritones have this habit of cropping up when we don't expect them. Yeah, we create music and the tritones appear within it. Now there are loads of other things we could say about tritones. For example, we could talk about their roles in minor keys. There's the scale of A natural minor, and that contains a tritone, but it's the same tritone as the key of C major, which is the relative major key of A minor. And that's great because it makes it really easy to modulate into C major, but also it means there isn't another tritone we can use further up the scale to have the same sort of 5-1 effect that we get in the major key. So we have to find ways around that. But there's one final thing about the tritone I want to mention because I think you'll find it particularly interesting, and that's the way that the tritone works in particular modes, and specifically in Lydian mode. Let's just have a quick refresher on what modes are. Mode is really just another word for key or scale. So both the major scale and the natural minor scale are modes, and they even have modal names. So the major scale is called the Ionian mode, and the natural minor is the Aeolian mode. But there are other modes as well, and they're all defined by the particular pattern of tones and semitones that make up their scales. So for example, the regular major scale has a pattern of tones and semitones that goes tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone, and it's the same pattern across all major scales. So let's go and look at F major. Tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. Okay, E flat major, tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. Now, different modes simply have different patterns of tones and semitones. And Lydian mode, which is the one we're interested in, goes like this. Let's play C Lydian. Tone, 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 semitone, tone, tone, semitone. As you can see, it's pretty much the C Lydian is pretty much the same as C major, but F has become F sharp, and instead of starting with tone, tone, semitone, we've got 3 whole tones, and we know what 3 whole tones make. They make a tritone. Now, Lydian is the only one of the principal modes that has a tritone as the note 4 steps above its tonic. Okay, and that has some really important and useful effects. Now, what underlies that effect is the fact that Lydian mode, and indeed any mode, has its own naturally occurring chords. You might be familiar with this from when you've seen my tutorials in the past, and I've talked about the diatonic chords of a major key. So for example, let's say we're in the key of C major, we can go up the scale of C major using simple triads, 3-note chords, using the notes of the scale to build the naturally occurring chords of C major. And if you have a song in C major, most of the chords in that song will be taken from that list of diatonic chords. And you can do exactly the same thing in any mode. So let's try building chords from Lydian mode. Okay, so there is C Lydian. And let's do exactly the same thing. Remember, we're going up using a triad, but only using the notes of the scale to build the chord. We get C, D major, E minor, F sharp diminished, G, A minor, B minor, and back to C. Can you see how different that is from the regular chords of C major? C, D minor, E minor, F. Lydian gives us C, D major, E minor, F sharp diminished. Now this has a number of effects. First of all, it makes Lydian very, very unstable. Because our ears are so trained to listen for major and minor keys, it's very easy for all modes, in fact, to accidentally resolve out into major and minor keys. But Lydian in particular really wants to take us off to the major key a fifth above the tonic, okay? So C Lydian can easily, whether it's accidental or on purpose, easily become G major. If you want to write a song or create an improvisation in Lydian, you have to manage your tonality. That's a subject we talked about in our last video, actually, on stride. You have to manage your tonality very, very carefully. But it does mean you can achieve some amazing effects. So one effect that's particularly beloved of movie composers is this, you know, finishing a piece of music. Yeah, you've probably heard that at the end of a Disney movie or something. All it's doing is finishing on the tonic chord, C major, but then for a bit of a flourish going up to D major, and that is a pure Lydian sound. Lydian has this lovely kind of edgy, magical, ethereal kind of sound. Okay, if you're a fan of Leonard Bernstein's West Side Story, then pretty much that whole musical, and it's incredibly clever musically, but pretty much the whole show, or at least a good part of it, is made up of Lydian oriented or Lydian themed songs, and the tritone appears endlessly. So it appears in the theme at the start. There's a tritone, C to F sharp. I'm not playing it in the key it appears in the show. And there it's used to express tension and discord and the, you know, the anger between the two gangs, the Jets and the Sharks. But then later it crops up in a love song. Warning, I'm going to sing. Maria, I just met a girl named Maria. Okay, so Bernstein does this very clever thing where he uses this incredibly flexible tritone and first of all uses it to express anger, but then resolves it to create a love song. It's like we've gone from Stravinsky to Puccini, you know, two very different styles, exactly the same notes, just changed around. Another place in West Side Story where Lydian crops up is in the song Tonight. Okay, which uses the tonic chord. I think it's in G major. Uses the tonic chord followed by the major chord a tone above the tonic. Okay, so here's G Lydian, and our first three chords are G, A, B minor. Okay, and Tonight is particularly clever. It uses that Lydian tonality and that magic sound, but it also, Bernstein also uses ninth chords, adds 9 chords to make the transition between the two smoother, because it can feel like a bit of a jump sometimes. So we have G adds 9, so with the A added, going to A add 9 with the B added. So there, the A belongs to the next chord, and there the B belongs to the previous chord. There's more of a bridge between them. So that effect, my pet name for it is the magic seconds, because it's so kind of magical. You know, as I said in the movie example, Lydian does give you these incredibly rich sounds, and it's all because of that tritone above the tonic. Okay, so that's it for our lovely tritone. Yeah, it's got this terrible reputation, but I really love it. It's responsible for such beautiful sounds, especially when you embed it in that lovely rich Lydian tonality. So there we go. If you have any questions or comments, please do put them in the comment thread underneath this video. Remember to like the video. Remember please to subscribe to my channel if you haven't subscribed already, and hit that little bell notification icon so you get regular updates of what I'm up to. Check out my social media, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Links are all below. And of course, please do check out my books and my Patreon. You'll find all the relevant links in those little pop-up cards that appear in the top right-hand corner, and once again in the description text right underneath this video. Have fun with all that. I'll see you again very soon.